Okay, so for our discussion this week, we're going to take some of what we've already created in the code along and we're going to move on to help you if you've never done functions, which I'm guessing many of you have not, and how we can implement them with the code we've already written and write some new code. And I will complete what I think I'm going to have you do at the end, but we'll first just do this setup part. So what you want to do, and I've already done the setup, is I've created my week 3 folder in my public repo, right? Remember my public repo here. And then I have my index file, of course. I did add a title, which was, it's nice to have that because I can always see which one I'm working on. And then here's the code without the comments that we finished last time. I think the only thing I may have done to this is that I did clean up some of the verbiage because I thought it was too long. Okay, so that's the first thing. So when we have two variables, right, hopefully you remember why we had to use let because of the way we were calculating the carbon footprint points. I think I am going to start abbreviating carbon footprint to CFP. Just because it might be easier, or maybe just CF for even shorter. But all right, so what I want you to do now, right, is we're going to write our first function. And actually, I should give you a link. So let me just go MDN functions. Okay, there we go. I'll give you that link in there. I didn't do it already. So a function statement. Right, so here's your kind of typical function statement. It has parts, like I showed you on the conditional. And we're going to introduce this in a little more simpler way. But again, reading through this content will be helpful, in my opinion, to kind of help you just see some of the things around, and these are called function. There's different names we give to them based on the way we've written them. We'll talk about parameters and arguments as we move through some of this discussion, but really this is just a short introduction in this discussion about functions, and then next week it'll be all about functions. So you'll just get introduced to it this week. So when we want to write a function, and I'm just going to go to the top of the page because generally we have our functions on top. Don't have to be, and actually I'll probably talk about modules next week because it would be a perfect time to start thinking about them. So you start with the function, right? And then you give it, whatever, and don't type this yet, whatever you want to name it. Okay? So whatever you want to name the function. Now you do want to name it something related to what it's doing. Now what is a function? A function is a series of statements that you can repeatedly call again and again, okay? And that's really its benefit, is that it's going to, it encapsulates not the right, but it's going to have inside of it statements, right? Those statements, and this is true in coding, we often want to write a series of commands and we want to run them again and again and again, not just one time. Because right now the way this code is written, it's all running, and this is important, so let's just go ahead and start here, right, in the global scope. Okay, so once and remember I was talking about so this is actually block scope here, right? So I couldn't say, but most of this code, right, we're running it in the global scope. So what we're going to end up doing now is because when you're programming, you really want to minimize the amount of things in your global scope because it's so powerful, because wherever is in your global scope is available anywhere in your code, which is both a good thing, but you'd want to minimize it. So in this example, we're going to write a function that will do this calculation, right, for the carbon footprint related to household, okay, related to number in household. So what might we name that? So one name is determine, right, and I would say household points, and I would even maybe abbreviate that. And then we're going to open and close a parentheses. Okay, and then we're going to do a code block. So whenever, and I could have left the other variable name I put up there. But this, because you get to determine what this name is, but the rest of this, and there are different ways to write functions. You could actually give a named function, so you could say const. You don't do this part yet, test, right? And then you could say equals, right? So there's another way to write function, right? You could do it this way, right? Okay, I think that's right. No, actually, gotta get rid of this. See, that's why I didn't want you to do it. Because really, when we look at the best way to write functions, you'll see different, and we'll actually end up writing probably some of those name functions later. There's a benefit to giving them a name, but in this case, function, and again, I've given you a name I want for this one, and we'll talk about what these are, but these are what we're going to pass to the function. For this first one, we'll just write it and we won't do that, but I'm just FYI. And then we have the code block. Again, we've seen code blocks when we had conditional code. So in this case, what we want to do is and now we have to think about, okay, how much of this code would we want to rerun every time we have maybe a new user filling out our web page, because think about ultimately what you're going to do is create probably a page that has a form that the user would fill out to determine their carbon footprint, right? So would we want the setting up of the beginning carbon footprint points to 0? And the answer is probably not, because right, we're going to calculate it here, so we would want this to be set for now out on the global space. And then the number, right, which right now is what, and this is a term, right, we're hard coding these numbers in here. Later we'll be learning about form inputs and other things. So, and then we have the console log. So then we have the logic. So this is probably the biggest candidate at this point to go inside the function. Okay, so I just want to talk about that, and then we have the console log. So this kind of makes sense, maybe inside, maybe not, depending on how we write it. Okay, but before we even do any of that, let's just actually call it. So if we determine how, in this, so let me just say, if we don't do this, if we just write the function like it is here, right, and we do console.log inside the function, right? At this point in our code, let's go over and look, right? Refresh, look at our source, see our main, and see that the function is there, right? So the function exists, it's been declared, and if I actually came down here and said determine, right, it actually is a function. And now what this is DevTools telling you, yeah, you have a function there, right? And I actually could call it, and calling it is actually using this open and close parentheses. This is invoking the function. I could do that here, right? But if I want it to happen in my code, I actually have to call it, invoke it. There's different terms, right, in here. Okay, so what I've done is I've set up the function. In this case, out on the global scope, I've called the function. Now, you don't have to only call functions from the global scope. You'll see that as we move forward. But for now, by making that one change, doing a refresh, right, we can see we have the inside the function. So now we're inside of it. We're calling it, right? And actually when it gets to this point, matter of fact, let's just do that. I think that would be helpful. Oh, look, the breakpoint's already there. Matter of fact, let's do this. Let's set a breakpoint here. And actually it'll make you do it inside the function. Okay. Well, what will happen is now that the file has been kind of a quick compile, now we're running through it line by line. It's going to say, okay, I have a function. Okay. It's already set up the other things at this point, right? And it's saying, okay, now I'm ready to actually run, right, this function. I'm not sure why it jumped over the other. I'm kind of curious. But now I'm going to invoke it. I step into it. Oh, what happened? Oh, I must have accidentally had, let me see. Let me refresh here. Oh yeah, that's right. Because I've set it inside of here, it's actually yeah, the breakpoint doesn't happen until I'm inside the function. That's actually right. So I can't set it there, but I could set it here, right? Which would be the next line here. And I apologize, that's probably a little confusing. But more than anything, I wanted to stop execution before we even get to this function called down here. That's really what I was going for. So let me do that now. Okay, so I already have the function set up, and that's because execution is already past that. And if I hit step, then I'm stepping through these two, which we've already done this. We know if it's 3, right, it's going to evaluate the first one, false, second one, false. This one's true, right, calculates it, goes down to the console. And now we're going to actually invoke this function, which will pass control, and this is important. It's going to pass control of the program back to the function, or up to the function, okay? And this is, this is just your beginning of understanding functions, but you start to see how powerful they are because we can call them again and again. But now inside of this, now we'll have statements that we will get to run. And I'm just going to show you now. We ran whatever statement I had. Now we're back here, and now we're done. And again, just hit play to play through. Okay. All right. So now that we've seen how to write a function, now let's actually place inside of that function, and we'll leave this here for a minute, okay? Let's actually do this. Grab all of this, and I'm just going to, there's a couple ways. I'm going to use my keyboard and my shift key to select all that, and then I'm just going to drag it up to here. Now you could copy and paste it, okay? It's not the most beautiful thing in the world based on the way that happens, so one thing I could do is I could select Control A, right, and I could say Format Selection With Prettier, and it would clean that up for me. And you really want to know how to do that because oftentimes, and again, all I did is I did once. Let me do undo and show you. So what I saw was, and I would have hoped it would have come through better, but it must have been the way I had my cursor. But now I can just select all that, right click. And I think format selection would have worked as well because the default would be, in this case, prettier. And that's just that extension, okay? So now I have a function, right? In that function, and by the way, you also want this, so I should have done, I didn't include that when I had that. So now I'm going to do this again. I'm going to now let it play through. So now I have my function and set a key. Now, because we don't want to watch everything else, we want to watch what happens in here. Okay, so let's refresh. When execution gets here to the point of executing this line, notice that at this point the console log that was showing up before is now not showing up. Okay, and that's because we haven't reached that point in our code because it is now inside of a function. So let's step into it. Now we're inside the function. Matter of fact, we should see that here. Cool, inside. We know what happens here. Cool. Yeah, it's 3, calculates it, does the console log, returns. Now again, it returns the control back to here. Returns becomes important later when we talk about probably maybe even here. But again, now that I'm done, I could hit next. It'll be boom. I'll just let it play through. Remember, if you see some of this other after your code runs, just hit play through to see that complete. That way you don't have to step through it. Okay, so this is working pretty good. And our variable declarations sitting out in the global space, right, are happening, and then we're calling the function, right? There is, we could play around with, do we have to have it here? So like, as an example, I'm going to cut this out. And just to show you, right? Put it up here. And do we let it play through, right? Okay. So in this case, we can have the function, the variables declared, before the function. It's just a coding style. I'm not sure why my mouse is having such a hard time here. But generally, when I've looked at programmers who do professional programming, I'm going to do undo here just to bring, and by the way, I'm doing in my Control Z to undo that code. Okay, so now let's look at this, right? Because at this point, there we go. We have this now. What's the benefit here, right? Well, we could call it many times, right? And we could, here, we could change this value, right? That was the first one. We could change this value. But what would be more helpful and more efficient is actually to pass this value into the function, okay? Because right now we're setting up a variable in the global space. Remember, the idea is over time you want to learn to minimize your amount of variables in your global space. So what we could do here is I could pass a value of 3 here, and I could pass a value of 4 here. I could get rid of this, okay? Because I'm going to run it the first time, I'm going to pass 3 to it. I'm going to run it again, I'm going to pass 4 to it. Okay? Now, what these are is arguments, right, and parameters. So I'm passing the function an argument. And inside of that, it has to then declare that variable for the local scope here. So now that's where I would say number in household as a variable name. Okay, now why would I do that? I would do that because my code already has that variable name set up, so I don't have to actually do it. I don't have to do a different variable name. And what will happen, and I'm going to show you this in DevTools because it starts to make more sense, right? Is that I'm doing this because each time I run it, I'm passing that argument, right, into the function. I believe sometimes arguments and functions, matter of fact, let's just do that, right? So arguments and parameters, functions, JavaScript. Okay. My mouse is really having a hard time. I'm going to have to get me some new I need to charge it, right? So actually what's kind of fun sometimes is just actually look at images because they help you see it, right? So these are arguments, what we're passing when we call the function. Now, that's not a good example because it's a little more, here's a better one, right? So arguments are passed in and they become parameters. So that's a better image there. Okay, and we can name this whatever we want. Whatever we want here, we can name that whatever we want. Okay? This could be, if I named it like, you know, and I'm not going to, so don't do this part, whatever, right? Then because that variable name is going to be used inside this block scope, because now instead of global scope inside of the function, I have block scope. When referring to the thing that I'm passing in, it has to, you know, the code is going to look for this and it's going to say, hey, I don't know that variable because you haven't told me by passing it in what the name is. I'll show you this in code. Okay, so let's go over here. All right, let's let it run through. So now we see our 2 function calls and it's actually paused right here on our first one. So let's step in, see it's 3. So now if I step in, and this is such an important thing to understand. So look at what I'm inside the function. The number in household that I've passed, the argument becomes the parameter, really I'm just passing it in, now is going to be a variable. That variable's value for this function call is 3. So now I'm going to run through the code. Good. All right, good. So we know that worked. But now we get to run it again. And this is really the fun part, right? Now we get to run it again. This time, number in household, right, is 4. And you can actually see DevTools trying to help you out here by showing you the line. Also, there's other places this variable is set, shown in scope. Notice over here. Okay, so we're just going to continue through, stepping through. This time, we know it's going to go there, 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 hits 4, calculates it, boom, there it is. Okay, so now we have been able to, we've made our code so much more efficient by using functions. Okay, all right, so here's what I want you to do. You needed to do, hopefully you got this, when you got the setup done, right? And then code along, and now you're at functions. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to pause here, and then I'm going to kind of give some thought to the challenge, not the challenge, but what we're going to do for the discussion this week.